May I introduce Professor Soekadar. He is a physician scientist in clinical neuroscience and Einstein Professor of Clinical Neurotechnology at the Charité Berlin. ERC starting and consolidator grant for research on brain-machine interfaces. So that sounds like a first talk in a brain session. Stage is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I make use of the headset and try to move a little bit around. So the idea to connect machines not only to the body, as we have heard, but to the brain is an old idea. And it has been implemented in various science fiction movies and books, and it has been always part of this science fiction genre. But only recently, a few years back, this whole science fiction narrative moved into mainstream. And this is because not only big companies invested into neurotechnologies that measure brain activity or change brain activity in an artificial way, not only these big companies invested and increased the number of patents by more than 500% in the last 10 years, but two people that you probably know, one is Mark Zuckerberg and the other one is Elon Musk. They also got interested in this technology, in neurotechnology. And the idea is to connect the brain with machines. And the motives are of course, there are various motives to do it. But I wanted to give you now an overview of where we are, where we came from, and like what I am doing in the clinical context. So, first of all, the brain-computer interfaces translate brain activity into controlled signals of external devices. And this can be a prosthesis, a robotic arm, or it can be also computer. And, well, you can record the brain activity using electroencephalography, but you can also measure the magnetic fields of the brain. And usually we've used these helium-cooled squid MEG devices, but now we have quantum sensors, and I will talk a little bit about it in the last part. You can also measure the oxygenization, so metabolic activity of the brain using near-infrared spectroscopy or functional MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. Then you can open the skull and you can implant electrodes into the brain directly. And of course, there are different levels of invasiveness. So you can remove the bone, at least then you don't have this dampening effect of the bone tissue, and you can place electrodes directly on the dura, or you open the dura and place the electrodes underneath. And then, of course, you can go even more invasive and implant microelectrodes, and you can also go even deeper into the brain with DBS, deep brain stimulation. So these are a number of devices that have been developed now, and there is now a new device that's based on the stent technology. So stents, you know, all for decades they were used for the heart to extend the blood vessels or the carotids. And you can also use these stents, because they are out of metal, to record intracranial EEG. And you place these stents into the blood vessels and place them somewhere in the brain, and you can record electric activity in the neighborhood, and you don't have this dampening effect of the bone. So the first clinically meaningful application of the brain-computer interfaces was invented or demonstrated by a guy who was actually growing up here in Vienna. His name is Niels Bierbaumer, and he enabled a patient who was locked in, so he was unable to speak or move, to control his brain, electric brain activity, to select letters on the screen. And with this ability, he could write a whole letter. And this letter was published in Nature, and this created a lot of enthusiasm for the clinical use of brain-computer interfaces as means to restore communication. And in parallel, and this is what also AppFETS also pioneered, brain-computer interfaces were developed to restore movement. And these are examples of implantable microelectrodes that are used to connect these different devices with the brain, and through the mechanism of operant conditioning of neural cell ensembles and single cells, they are able to control 3D robotic arms, and they can even control several prosthetic devices, left and right. And what they've been also achieved was bidirectional brain-computer interfaces. So here in this example, there are 4 UTA arrays, or microelectrode arrays that were implanted in the sensory and motor areas of this patient. And you can see that there were 4 sensors in the prosthetic arm attached, and whenever the patient was touching an object, there was a step function that translated the force into an electric current delivered directly to the brain. So the more force, the more electricity. Very simple formula. And what you can see here is that when the patient was asked to make this kind of task, he was much, much faster. And we heard about it in the first part of this conference. If you provide sensory feedback directly to the brain, your versatility to really use the prosthetic arms is much, much higher and better. So it doubled the speed. So, but there is a problem. So if we go invasive, if we implant devices into the brain, of course there is the risk of bleedings, at least, and infections. You could die from it. And there is no certification for long-term use of these devices. So usually they are implanted, and usually most of the work has been done in epileptic patients, where you have to do the surgery anyways, and then you leave the electrode there. But actually they are not supposed to stay in the brain for a lifetime. And most of these demonstrations were not really made outside of the laboratory. So these demonstrations are set up in the laboratory with at least one engineer in the background with a red button to press the red button if something goes wrong. And well, if you have to remove or repair the device, you have to undergo another surgery. And not only this, so here you see, of course, there is a reaction of the body if you implant something into the brain. Not only this, if you implant into the body and you are a commercial entity and you go bankrupt, the device will stay in the patient's brains, and who is responsible then? Whom are you going to call if the device isn't working anymore? So this was a topic that was also raised by Nature end of last year to make a topic out of it, because billions are now invested into neurotechnologies that are partly also implantable, and we need to make sure that those patients who of course benefit a lot because they can do things that they couldn't do before, are somehow also protected if something goes wrong in the economic mechanisms of the companies. So since there are so many disadvantages of going invasive, I have been mainly focusing on non-invasive technology. And here you see an example of quadriplegic patients. They are all not able to move their fingers, so they need always assistance of someone else. They cannot control, they cannot grasp a cup or a pen or a piece of paper. And we have equipped these patients who are in a wheelchair with an exoskeleton that opened and closed their hands, and this was controlled through their EEG and eye movements. And with this, whenever they were thinking about closing the hand was closing, they could manipulate these objects, and when they wanted to release, they would use electrooculography, an oculoversion. And you can see that the device could be used outside of the laboratory, so this gentleman could, for the first time, after many years, use the fork to feed himself. And we asked the patients what they would like to do, because there was no clinical test to evaluate how valuable this device would be. And this guy, he wanted to eat potato chips, because he always had to ask someone else to put these potato chips into his mouth. And you can see how much this improved his quality of life at that moment. Yeah? So we used the same device in patients who had a stroke. So they were paralyzed, and in some cases they were so severely paralyzed that they couldn't use the hand anymore, sometimes for decades. And we used the same exoskeleton, brain-controlled exoskeleton, for several weeks, every day at least 40 minutes. And what we could see is that after 1 month of daily training, some of the patients could move their fingers again without the exoskeleton. And then, of course, we were surprised and we wanted to know what happened in their brain. And what we found is that this is before the training. So these were patients with a subcortical stroke. And when you ask them to move the paralyzed fingers, they activate the whole motor cortex. Yeah, and you can also sometimes see, because they try it and they actually make a fist with the other side, they really try hard and the whole brain is lighting up, but the fingers are not moving. So after the training, after 1 month, what we could see is that the brain reorganized and the activation was shifting to the area that was trained with the brain-computer interface, and that was the perilesional area of the brain, and that correlated with the improvement of motor function. So what this says is you cannot only use brain-computer interfaces for assistance, for example, to communicate, but you can also use these brain-computer interfaces to induce plasticity in the brain. And this plasticity can be beneficial for motor recovery. So you can see this shift here. And now, how do we implement this into hopefully then a viable product for the patients? Because if it has a potential, we want to make it available. And this is, you can see a bag of potato chips. Without the exoskeleton, no chance. No chance. With an exoskeleton, she can do the same task within a few seconds. So what is important here is that we restore bimanual hand function, not the function of only one hand, because the woman has a functioning hand. It is always about the coordination and integration of both hands. So that's the trick here. And the main problem that I was encountering when I was working with this was there was no clinical test to evaluate the value. So I had to ask the patients and I had to take a video and hopefully make a convincing case that this was actually helpful in daily life. There was no clinical test to evaluate. So we developed a clinical test to evaluate the benefits of exoskeletons in bimanual hand function, in quadriplegia, but also in stroke. So one is called the BBIT, and the other one is BBITS. And we did this with an international consortium with people from America and Asia to make sure that this is also generalizable across different cultures. And these are different tasks that you have in daily life, like pouring a glass of water or open toothpaste and apply toothpaste on the toothbrush and so on. And you can then score these tasks by the ability to grasp, manipulate, and then also lift these different objects. And now I wanted to conclude the first part. So I have shown you that assistive and restorative neural exoskeletons are effective clinical tools to improve quality of life in severe paralysis. And these tools can be already applied now. When I was here, maybe when I started 10 years ago, it took half an hour, 40 minutes to put on the EEG. It was very cumbersome. The computers had to carry around 1,000 cables. Now we can do the same thing in 10 minutes. Yeah, we can mount all the equipment within 10 minutes, do the calibration for another 10 minutes, and then you can go and use the brain-computer interface to restore bimanual hand function. And that is a novelty. Yeah, and we need to make this available for the patients. So I have also shown you that if you use these brain-computer interfaces on a daily basis, you can induce functional and structural plasticity associated with neurological recovery. And, well, 10 minutes, it's very different from 10 or 20 years ago. And the best way to integrate this into a real application in stroke patients is to use these exoskeletons, brain-controlled exoskeletons, as a technical aid in physiotherapy, to enable the physiotherapist to interact with the patient to restore bimanual hand function. If those physiotherapists have patients that have no finger function, what do they do? They learn to compensate. So they actually train the healthy hand and compensate somehow, but this is something that will, of course, not help to restore the function. So this tool can help the physiotherapist to really engage in a much better way. So I talked about motor, so motor BCI, and here brain activity is translated into control movements. Then there is sensory feedback, which of course is fed back to the brain, and you have a closed loop here. And what we've seen now in stroke, that there is neuroplasticity, functional and structural plasticity. There is no reason to believe that this is only valid for the motor domain. Yeah? So that's the first point. And the other point is, how can we even improve that? So we have patients who actually don't have a lot of sensory feedback. They can see, maybe if they are not blind, they can see it, but they can't feel it. So how can we improve it? And I talked about these bidirectional BCIs. And this is a possibility to improve the versatility of brain-computer interfaces, to add the adaptive closed-loop neuromodulation. And that's something that I want to pursue in my lab. And of course, in the invasive business, this has been already done. And this is an example that goes beyond the motor, because I wanted to not only talk about motor. So this is Sarah, and Sarah is depressed, so severely depressed that nothing helped her. And she got 10 electrodes into her brain implanted because no one knew how to treat her. She was severely suicidal. So they thought, okay, let's do it and implant electrodes in the brain. And she was running on the ward for 1 week and always pressing a button when the deep depression was coming over her. And then they analyzed the data, and what they found is that the activation in the amygdala correlated with her subjective experience of being at the darkest place she can imagine. And then they looked for another place where to stimulate her brain to suppress this activity of the amygdala. And in the end, they implanted one electrode in the internal capsule and one in the amygdala. And whenever in the amygdala there was too much activity, it was interrupted automatically by the machine, so that she actually was not transitioning into this state. And the stimulation just needed to be for a few seconds. So 2 few seconds was sufficient to interrupt this brain dynamics. And afterwards she said, so she was after 1 week in a much, much better state. Of course, the depression is not completely gone, but at least it's much, much better than before. Yeah? So this is an example of a closed-loop system that has to be implanted. So how can we do this non-invasively? And you maybe know these methods like electric transcranial, like through electrodes on the head, attached to the head, transcranial electric stimulation or transcranial magnetic stimulation. The main problem is shown here. They are not very focal. You are stimulating half of the brain with it. Yeah? And it's very dependent on the biophysical properties of your brain. So that's the reason why we have developed a principle and system at the Charité that uses temporal interference of magnetic fields. And with this temporal interference, you have the advantage that you can focalize the stimulation. You can even go deeper into the brain, which you cannot do with TMS. So you don't need to implant. You can precisely plan the stimulation. You are very flexible in the targeting, because depending on the intensity of the magnetic fields, you can stir the target area around, so you don't need to move the coils. And there is no placebo, no sensory confound. And most of the time when you stimulate the head, you feel the tingling, you feel the clicking noises and so on. Here you don't feel anything. There's just some steady noise from the stimulator, but you don't hear anything besides that. So this is the first prototype, and we have now a full system to do this and to explore this further. And of course, we want to record the brain activity and make the stimulation dependent on brain dynamics. And EEG is okay, but it's not really good, because if you do it in real time, you can actually throw away most of the data, because it's contaminated with a lot of artifacts. So what can you do? You can use magnetoencephalography. And this allows you to record from DC up to several hundreds of hertz. For example, gamma, which is very, very important to record the gamma activity. And before you had these MEGs, you couldn't move the head. Now you have these quantum sensors, and they are at least to a certain part mobile, so you can move the head a little bit, and you can actually repair them much faster, and they are also cheaper. So the idea is now to combine. You wanted to take a picture. The idea is to combine the quantum sensors with electric stimulation. And the question is now, is this feasible? And people told me, you're crazy, this doesn't work, they are so sensitive, you waste your time. But it was possible to do it with a transcranial electric stimulation. And as you can see, we have now also implemented alternating current stimulation together with quantum sensors that are stimulating at the same very frequency. So you have a brain signal at 10 hertz, and you stimulate the brain with 10 hertz, and it's still possible to distinguish the brain activity from the external stimulation signal. It's still possible. And we have shown this, and also that it really has a very robust behavioral effects if you do that. So now from the ERC, I have the honor to have received this consolidator grant for the next 6 years to develop a system based on these temporal interference, magnetic stimulation, and the quantum sensors. And the idea is we record the brain dynamics with the quantum sensors and stimulate the brain at the same time. And hopefully then, and you see what I'm doing, frontal lobe, so that's the psychiatric applications going beyond the motor domain. That's the target where we are going. So, of course, that raises a number of neuroethical questions. Well, in the clinical field, of course, there's, from my point of view, an ethical imperative to use this technology for people who have no other means to help themselves. So this is pretty clear for me, but the question is what happens when we use these technologies to augment or to go beyond the normal function? So that's the reason why this has to be anticipated and considered and discussed. What kind of society do we want to have? And we'll talk about this in the evening, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. And now I want to conclude. I hope I'm still in time. So I have shown you that assistive and restorative brain-computer interfaces are effective and are ready to be used now. Combining these unilateral brain-computer interfaces with neuromodulation paves the way for a new generation of very powerful neurorestorative tools that go beyond the motor domain and goes into restoration of frontal lobe function. And of course, new sensors and stimulation techniques render now non-invasive bidirectional BCI is feasible. So that's what we are working on at the Charité. And now this is a little bit the transfer to also your talk. Of course, we use artificial intelligence on different levels. These AI-enhanced bidirectional brain-computer interfaces, of course, raise complex neuroethical questions that must be anticipated. But how this is now actually put in place, like what kind of algorithms we are using and what the perspective is going to be presented by the next speaker. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.